You're tuned to the wavelength of your own beauty. It's your host, Ahmed Yunus, and this is The Study. The book explains that Nelson Mandela grew up as the son of a counselor to a local king. And perhaps that's enough for this passage. Mandela closely observed the style and manner of the king. Chieftaincy was the pivot around which the life of the community and his own life revolved. The king was not an educated man. He could neither read nor write, but he was the custodian of Thembu history and custom. The king may have been born to leadership, but he was also seen as the people's servant. Look at that, servant leadership, there it is. Chieftaincy was treated as a privilege, not just a right. The chiefly style of leadership was not about vaulting oneself to the front, but about listening and achieving consensus. The meetings of the royal court, which were like democratic town hall meetings, were the locus of leadership. All of the men from the village came, and anyone who wanted to speak could do so. Men, of course, women can't speak, but it was the custom for the chief to listen to the views of his counselors in the community before uttering his own opinion. The king always stood up straight and proud. When he spoke at the end of a meeting, he would summarize the views that he had heard. The king, in what would become South Africa in the 50s, is doing what big consulting firms are trying to convince people and corporations to do every day. Listen and say back what you heard. The king was strong-willed, but he did not let his own will supersede that of the community. That is what Mandela means by leading from behind. A good chief does not grandly state his opinion and command others to follow him. I'm going to change them all. She listens, she summarizes, and then she seeks to mold opinion and steer people toward an action, not unlike the young boy herding cattle from the back. Mandela regards this as the best of the African tradition of leadership. He sees the West as the bastion of personal ambition, where people fight to get ahead and leave others behind. The Renaissance idea of individualism never penetrated Africa like it did Europe and America. The African model of leadership is expressed as Ubuntu, the idea that people are empowered by other people, that we become our best selves through unselfish interaction with other people. Nelson Mandela was a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, and one of the wonderful passages in this book is a passage that relates to Mandela's knowledge of Lincoln. I remember arriving one weekend morning at Mandela's house in Houghton. Stangle, man, all these words. In the driveway beyond the front gate, Mandela and a group of his advisors sat in the shade in a small circle of folding chairs, engrossed in discussion. I pulled up a chair just outside the circle. What can you imagine? It's like Mandela's in a circle and you pull up a chair. It's amazing. What struck me most forcefully was that these men were talking animatedly, some of them criticizing Mandela and telling him very directly that he was wrong about certain positions. All the men were respectful, and some were quite fiery and outspoken. Mandela sat straight, almost unmoving, listening intently with a neutral expression. Who does that remind you of? The king he was raised watching. Teach yourselves and your children to observe. Observing breeds wisdom. He would make an excellent poker player. Only at the end of the meeting, as the fellows were getting ready to go, did Mandela speak, and he summarized their views without saying exactly where he stood. I noticed that the men seemed more jovial once they had gotten their opinion off their chest, regardless of whether or not they had persuaded Mandela. Mandela knew that the surest way to diffuse an argument is to listen patiently to the opposing point of view. I later asked him about this discussion and his leadership style. Quote, "We are a democratic organization," unquote, he told me. Quote, "I sometimes come to the National Executive Committee with an idea, and they disagree with me and overrule me, and I obey them, even when they are wrong. That is democracy." He gave a great belly laugh. But he knew that in many instances his own views on individual issues mattered far less than the democratic process, that it was better to lose on an individual matter and allow democracy to win. When Mandela became president, he presided over cabinet meetings in the same way. Here's Lincoln. He did his best to see that opposing views were aired, if not always adhered to. He almost always spoke last, and more briefly than anyone else. On occasion, he mentioned Abraham Lincoln to me as a model of leadership. He had learned about him as a school child. In fact, as a young man, Mandela had wanted the role of Lincoln in a school play, but there was one student even taller than he who got the part. Mandela ruefully acknowledged that he ended up playing John Wilkes Booth. Mandela was aware that Lincoln had put some of the fiercest rivals in his cabinet. Team of rivals, we'll cover it together. And Mandela likewise put members of the opposition in his own first cabinet. He was impressed by the way Lincoln used persuasion rather than force in managing his cabinet. He once told an anecdote he recalled about Lincoln talking someone out of being in his cabinet and ended by saying, quote, "It is wise to persuade people to do things and make them think it is their own idea," unquote. Perhaps we can end the book here. Perhaps this can be an aspiration for us in our own development. Nelson Mandela is comfortable with contradictions, even his own. When I was with him, I sometimes thought of the lines from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. He is large. He does contain multitudes. And he often contradicts himself. He understands that consistency for its own sake is a false virtue, and that inconsistency is not automatically a flaw. He knows that humans are complex, and that people have a myriad of motives. The courage to be oneself in the most difficult of times. Why don't we end this week with a passage from the Tao of Wu, written by the abbot, the RZA, one of the founders of the Wu-Tang Clan, one of the most brilliant music engineers of our time, of our era. And, often we see an interdisciplinary approach as contradiction. Often we see code switching as contradiction. Often we see the changing of positions as contradiction. And I think that one of the things I learned from Rick's book, on Mandela is that greatness can only come if each of us makes an authentic effort to travel down that road of untested feasibility for who we can become as individuals. And that requires an interdisciplinary approach. It requires thick skin. It requires support systems. It requires inspiration. It requires innovation. It requires courage. It requires courage. And often courage is presented as elusive. But it is not. It is inherent in the creation of each of us as a human being. Can you hear the birds singing their morning song before the sun comes up? The Riza says in the Tao of Wu, page 114, producing music is like playing an instrument. It's an expression of yourself. Every pianist touches the keys differently. Every violinist bows based on the strength of their arm, the structure of their hand. That's why Miles Davis is one of the greatest players, because of the spirit that he blows through the trumpet. It's his. Creativity is always unique because it's you. It's the same thing with producing. You have to sit there and find yourself in the sound. You don't need someone asking you, hey, do you want more bass on your kick? Or giving you a scientific explanation of how it should be. A lot of engineers went to school for this, so they'll tell you if the vocals are at 2 kilohertz, your snare should be either above or below, so it doesn't clash with the vocals. But I found that sometimes the snare has to clash with the vocals to punctuate them. You have to ignore the science of it sometimes, even the logic of it. Sometimes real discoveries take a leap in consciousness that's outside the intellect.
حضرات السادة الركاب، أهنئكم بسلامة الوصول إلى مطار القاهرة الدولي. أرجو أن تكونوا قد استمتعتم بالرحلة، برجاء التوجه لأخذ حقائبكم من مسار الحقائب رقم 5.